Good evening. You're watching News Night and I'm Athar Khan. Today, Secretary of State of the US, Mike Pompeo, who met his Indian counterpart, Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, had a lot to talk about in the joint press conference they addressed. We, of course, also got the central theme of the idea where this relationship is actually going. What we understood from their statements and, of course, through our sources in the Ministry of External Affairs as well, was that the Indo-US relationship does have some differences, but nothing is insurmountable as far as these two nations are concerned. Common ground on energy, common ground on defense, common ground on security and terrorism was achieved, but there were some hiccups as well, and I'll get to that in just a bit here. But the line of the day clearly was when Mike Pompeo mentioned Iran, and in the terms he mentioned Iran, of course, which left the Indian side, I'm using the word very carefully here, a little red-faced on Iran. I'll get to that also in just a bit, and I'll ask my guests where they see this relationship going on from here on, and given the fact that in just a couple of days, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Donald Trump are in fact meeting in Osaka at the G20 summit. On the sidelines there will be a bilateral and where that relationship and the sticky issues or the tricky issues, those flies in the ointment, where will they go, how will that be resolved, and how will those differences be ironed out? All that in just a bit, but first take a look at what I thought personally was really the telling remark of the day. This is Mike Pompeo speaking about India's partner Iran. Take a look now.
It's a little bit of a repetition, but really, I mean, we have a certain perspective on Iran, obviously, from where we are based, and the Secretary shared with me the American concerns on Iran. I would say, frankly, I guess both of us certainly came out much better informed of each other's concerns in that regard. In terms of common ground, though I used it for trade, we have common ground on energy as well. I mean, for us, it is important that any global energy supplies remain predictable, that they remain affordable. And I think that's a concern to which Secretary Pompeo was certainly very, very receptive. I think he understands that this is today the world's fifth largest economy, which imports 85% of its energy, a large part of it from the Gulf. So I think he certainly gets, I guess I'm speaking for him, but I think looking at his face, he certainly gets what our interests are.
I'll just add on Iran, Chris. Look, we all know that we need to keep that waterway open for the reasons that were just described. We also know that Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terror. And we know the Indian people, they have suffered from terror around the world. So I think there's a shared understanding of threat and a common purpose to ensure that we can keep energy at the right prices and deter this threat, not only the threat in the narrow confines of the Middle East, but the threat that this terror regime poses to the entire world.
Joining us right now is Maruf Raza, consulting editor of Times Now. Also with us, former Ambassador Anil Trigunayat and Dr. Harinder Sekhon, Senior Fellow of the VIF. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me just take you back, Maruf, to what we just played out right now. And I'm using Secretary Pompeo's words here, suggesting that we have a shared understanding of that threat. Now, it was interesting. I was in that press conference. I was in that room. The foreign minister didn't clearly choose to correct his counterpart there, and I'm sure protocol did not dictate that. But there has been no clarification officially as to whether India shares that particular line of thought on Iran, although my sources tell me that India doesn't really share that definition of Iran. But don't you think that was a bit out of place, the way Mike Pompeo, almost as an afterthought, labeled Iran as the world's biggest state sponsor of terror? I mean, that could be a problem given the fact that we have cultural ties, we have historical ties with Iran. We might have stopped taking oil from them since May, but that still poses a problem for India, doesn't it?
Yeah, Athar, there is a lot of things that I need to address in your question, but they're all very valid. The first thing is, please understand that Mr. Pompeo is, to my mind, as right-wing, Bible-holding, strongly committed Christian and part of neo-American right-wing views as you can get in terms of a foreign secretary. Now, I'm not showing a communal bias here, but I think it is the biases of people like Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Bolton who are driving Mr. Trump on, and you'd be surprised with my view that Mr. Trump actually appears more moderate when he takes a stance on Iran compared to his two right-wing advisors. The second thing is that as far as Mr. Trump's statement goes, that, we sort of share the same concern that Iran is the biggest sponsor of terror in the world. I don't think we share that concern, because there are many people who see Iran as a long-term historic and strategic partner. Our sponsor of terror is Pakistan, and America, except for making pleasant announcements to suit Indian ears, hasn't really been able to twist Pakistan's tails enough, because its own agenda is threatened in Afghanistan if it disciplines Pakistan too strongly. And the third aspect is that while energy security is a very important aspect, and the Americans are just trying to tell the world that we are doing you a favor by keeping the Strait of Hormuz open because we are not going into a conflict situation, but the tension in the Gulf per se is in itself a cause for rising oil prices.
Absolutely.
And every time the prices rise by $10, Athar, it leads an impact on our GDP of 0.4%. So if the dollar price of the oil barrels rise from $60 to $85, and it could happen within a month's time, you could go back in your GDP projections and growth projections by
clearly,
1%.
and that was conveyed to the Americans, if my sources are to be believed. But I was still taken aback, really, at as I mentioned, and Dr. Sekho, I'd like to come to you on this as well. The fact that Mike Pompeo comes to India, Mr. Jaishankar is playing host there. The press conference is going, swimmingly, if I may use that word. But all of a sudden, Mike Pompeo drops that bomb when he, because of his own compulsions, as Maruf has said, names Iran as the world's biggest state sponsor of terror. But even our own foreign minister, while he says that yes, cross-border terrorism was discussed in the working lunch, did not name Pakistan. I mean, what does that tell you, really? The Americans can come and say whatever they want to suit their own purposes, but we can't even name the main, exporter of terror right across our border. What does that tell you about the relationship and where it's going?
I think we really have to be more assertive with the United States, and a few days back I was in another similar panel discussion. I think we really have to, because the US has not been very accommodating and concerned about our interests vis-a-vis China either, when they try to push us into a slot on the Indo-Pacific. And I think the whole debate on Iran is, it has to be centered around our energy security concerns. And also I think Iran is very important for settling Afghanistan. This is something which we need to engage with our interlocutors in the United States and drive home this point, because, and as you've rightly said, Iran is not the biggest state sponsor of terrorism. India faces a lot of problems from our Western neighbor, and I'm surprised that that has not figured in the talks earlier today.
Right.
And this is something which needs to be reiterated, because on the one hand, the United States says, recognizes India as its strategic partner. And then if we are not going to be aligned on some of our core interests and have differences where our security challenges are concerned,
here's where
I think
I was
that
completely
could
flummoxed,
put a
and I want
further
to
stress
absolutely.
on the
I agree
relations.
with you. I agree with you. Would that then mean, Ambassador Trigunayat, my next question is to you then, would that then mean, because throughout the day as I was covering Mr. Pompeo's visit, every dispatch I gave live on television, I expressed the hope that this time around India would pull its weight on the table. As far as we know, in the UPA era and even before that, India was the junior partner in the strategic alliance there, but now perhaps perhaps, especially on the back of the SCO summit, where we did in fact played nice with both Beijing and Moscow, it would perhaps be time now that India would pull its weight on the table. Does it look like then, after this statement and the apparent, well, no response from the Ministry of External Affairs or even the Indian government on whether or not they share the belief on Iran as far as the US is concerned, would that then indicate that we're back to playing second fiddle in this relationship? And isn't that bad for our interests?
Well, Athar, I have always propagated and supported the idea that we have to work and stand like an equal, and with authority and with firmness. And today, after watching Jaishankar, our External Affairs Minister, I must say that he was very forthright, he was very clear, and I'm quite confident the way he chose his words in his statement are clearly indicative that during the bilaterals and during the other meetings, our concerns were very strongly conveyed to them. And, you know, this visit was essentially to prepare for the talks between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump on the sidelines of the G20. India has very clearly, I mean, you see that all the four issues, whether it is energy security, trade issues, people-to-people contacts, or the H-1B visas, as they call the defense mechanism, whether it is S-400 or whatever, you could not have been more clearer in the public view that there are these major issues which India has stood its ground. We have communicated to them. Similarly, energy security is extremely important, and they have been told. And I do not think that India shares the US concern at all that Iran is the biggest sponsor of terrorism. In fact, many countries in the world, including the United States at one time, who helped bring up Taliban in Afghanistan during the war, we all know what is it. And they are all involved in one way or the other in destabilizing certain regimes and all. But at the same time, what one can say is that they needed a logic, some kind of a reason to be in the region, because they have otherwise no region. So they want to show that it is not the nuclear agreement, it is not something else.
Ambassador,
it is essentially...
Let me intervene for a second, and I want to bring Maruf here 1 second. Maruf, to me it sounded, the whole Iran sentence, which came almost as an afterthought, I was right there in the room, it came on the back of what our Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar had said. And the words he used were very, very interesting here, because I felt it was almost like an ambush as far as Iran is concerned. Let me just quote to you exactly, Maruf, what Mike Pompeo had said. He said, and I quote him now, "We also know that Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terror, and the Indian people have suffered from terror. So I think," and this is the important part, Maruf, he says, and I quote again, "So I think there is a shared understanding of the threat and a common purpose to ensuring that we keep energy at the right prices and deter this threat. Not only the threat in the narrow confines of the Middle East, but also the threat this terrorist regime poses to the entire world." These are very, very strong words. And he seems to suggest, Pompeo does, that India and the US have a shared understanding. Now, to this day, and as the time we are doing this show right now, I haven't gotten any indication from my sources within the MEA or any official communique from the MEA that there is any shared understanding on this line on Iran. So this would be an ambush then. What was Mr. Pompeo trying here?
We see Mr. Pompeo has come to India with fixed set of objectives, and ranging from sort of keeping the pressure on India to fall in line with Mr. Trump's tariff agenda, to getting India to fall in line and become one more of its coalition of supportive countries vis-a-vis Iran. It has already weaned us away from our oil supplies to Iran by arm twisting us. It has also put blockades in our long-standing relationship of drawing oil from Venezuela. And it is now also working very hard in breaking our defense ties with the Russians. Quite clearly, as far as the Americans are concerned, your enemy is not of our concern, but my enemy must be your enemy. I mean, this is bizarre. Secondly, America must do a little bit of looking into the mirror and smelling the coffee and answering. Who created the Al-Qaeda? Who created the ISIS? Who has been turning a blind eye to all the terror attacks on India by making some kind of superficial announcement here and there by declaring Masood Azhar or before that Hafiz Saeed as sponsors of terror. The fact of the matter is that the Indian government must dig its heels in. Now let me also bring in two other points. Point one is that as far as Mr. Jaishankar is concerned, he is a big champion of Indo-US ties. And this has been said by people close to him. So therefore, he is very keen to move the relationship forward. And successive governments in New Delhi have seen their future lie in America's basket. But the point is that are we going to kowtow to Americans and be held hostage to our own environment to fit America's agenda?
Yes.
Because the next thing is to draw us completely into a camp after Iran against China, and then get ourselves into a confrontation
and I was
mode
just
with
coming
the Chinese.
to that now,
and
because
please remember, the Trump administration is being driven by the Saudi Arabians and other Gulf countries who are paying the Trump administration indirectly by purchasing weapon systems from them to get Iran declared a global sponsor of terror.
Because the Saudis and the UAE and the Emiratis
got to be a little more pragmatic.
Absolutely, the Saudis and the Emiratis have their own vested interests there. The Saudis cannot stand the Iranians, we all know that, and Trump's domestic cup of woes is almost full. I don't even want to go into that, that's a separate debate. But Dr. Sekho, as far as pulling our weight at the table is concerned, clearly, in my eyes, clearly, and you can disagree with me, what Mr. Pompeo said about Iran and the fact that there has been no rebuttal, no clarification, nor any endorsement really by the MEA and our own foreign ministry on this. I believe that just goes on to say that we're not really willing to tackle the Americans at their own game. But as far as pulling our weight in different other sectors like energy, like defense is concerned, I believe the message today was that, look, we're going ahead with the S-400s. You can't really stop us there. We have a long-standing relationship with the Russians, and we can't just dehyphenate with the Russians so easily. But on the oil front with Iran, I believe India has made that concession. We will not be taking any more oil from Iran. I think that's also pretty clear now. But where do we go from here on end? If Mr. Pompeo and the Trump administration continue to hammer down the point that they consider Iran one of India's, historical partners in the past as well, a great strategic importance there as well. For example, let me just ask you this. If tomorrow the US plans to pull out of Afghanistan rather prematurely, which I believe they're working on right now, who's going to help us save our interests there? It's going to be Iran. Who's going to help us fight Pakistan and the terror coming from? It's going to be Iran. So why didn't India put up more of a fight when Mr. Pompeo laid that ambush? And I keep calling it an ambush because that's what it felt like, Dr. Sekho.
I entirely agree with what Maruf has said a while ago. I think we should not, when we are talking about strategic autonomy, which strategic autonomy is one of the basic tenets of our foreign policy, and strategic autonomy should not mean that we bow down and come under US pressure on everything. We paid a very heavy price for this in, when we were negotiating the nuclear deal in 2005, 2006. And it took us a long time to build up bridges with Iran. With Iran, we've traditionally had very good relations, and also culturally, we've had old cultural linkages with Iran, which cannot be wished away. It's a part of our near abroad. And not just Afghanistan, it's not that Iran is important only for Afghanistan, but when we are talking about the North-South transport corridor, Iran becomes an important link to Central Asia, because there's too much of dependence on Pakistan to fight the war on Afghanistan. I think the Americans should have learned their lesson well by now. And Iran offers you an alternative. And if the earlier administration had negotiated a deal or a nuclear deal with Iran, so I think there is something which needs to be assessed by the Americans. And India should actually be acting in its own self-interest.
Absolutely.
We have to have a balanced policy vis-a-vis. If we have given in on oil for the time being,
see that happening?
or
That's
even
my
in the
question
long
to you.
term.
I completely agree with your assessment there, but do you see that happening? Do you see India pulling its weight on certain issues like it has on the S-400 Triumph deal? I believe India has made that clear as well. But do you see this, where do you see this going? Because clearly we have to, and we did admit today that we have certain differences in the relationship, and differences can be overcome. It's a work in progress, etc., etc. All all that diplomatese, if you will, was very evident. But if our current foreign minister, who's a big advocate of Indo-US relationships, is keen on going forward with the Americans, he will have to work with Mr. Pompeo. He'll have to work with the Trump administration's line on Iran. And how will India then reconcile with that? Because I don't see that happening. We can't just, take our cake and eat it too. It rarely happens.
I think there are other aspects of the US-India relations which need to be highlighted more. The bilateral. There are, we are buying weapons from the United States. We are we are signing military hardware deals for military hardware, even if it is through the FMS route. We are technologically, we've signed we've had the inaugural 2+2 dialogue in September. And with India, the United States also is looking at other areas, other aspects besides just Iran.
Okay.
So I think this is something which we need not play up at the moment, but this is something where we need to have a dialogue between the experts and not have something like a grabbing headlines kind of a dialogue right now.
Yes.
But this is something which we need to engage with the United States on a long-term basis.
I do agree. But Maruf has a point here.
I think we should also be looking at trade.
I think trade is on the agenda, but Maruf, you very quickly, I think trade is on the agenda. I agree with you that this might perhaps should not be played up, but the way Mr. Pompeo can come to India while Mr. Jaishankar is playing host and name their priority and name Iran as the state sponsor of terror, but the Indians, our side, doesn't even name Pakistan. Of course, Pakistan came up in the discussion on cross-border terrorism, but the Indians didn't even name Pakistan. How long will that go on is my question. I think Maruf has a quick word, then I'll go to Ambassador Trigunayat, but very quickly, Maruf.
I think India needs to come in very strongly on naming Pakistan
is
because
that
our immediate, as I said earlier, we have to make that point.
Understood. Maruf, very quickly.
See, firstly, as far as America is concerned, it is used to, in the past, dealing with countries that are completely beholden to American blessings and the relatively smaller, lightweight countries. It is not really being able to comprehend how to deal with a country like India, which is obsessed with having an independent foreign policy. The second thing to understand as far as Iran is concerned, outside of Iran, we probably have the largest population of Shias in India. So there is an issue here which, if the Indian government wants to continue to be sensitive to that, the Americans must understand that.
Okay.
The third thing, and it's equally important, is the fact that America's wars are not our wars. We have our own concerns, and we have as yet been giving more to the Americans in terms of defense deals and whatever else than what we've got from them.
Right.
You cannot have a foreign policy with India from the United States based on transactions. Even transaction-wise, we've given them more transactions than they've given us.
Absolutely. Last word to Ambassador Trigunayat. Where do you see this coming? And do you agree with Maruf and Dr. Sekhon as far as India pulling its own weight and India making it very clear to the US that, yes, we are strategic partners, but we will not have this strategic partnership only on America's terms. That is detrimental, really. And that's not too strong a word, I might add. It's detrimental to India's own interests.
I fully agree with what you are saying and broadly agree with what my other colleagues have said. The fact remains is that India is speaking from the position of strength. It has made it very clear, even before Pompeo came here, that India will take whatever decisions it is in national interest. Now, what is your national interest is maybe debatable, but that is the interest that the government of the day decides, that this is in their national interest.
Okay.
As far as Iran is concerned, India is not taking the side in that sense, but it is obviously, we have to look after our own interest in the first place, and that is being communicated to the Americans extremely clearly. And as you mentioned, the last, his wordings that he used, trying to take India's war against terror with the war against Iran as being a terror-driven war, and India being complicit in that, is absolutely a figment of his imagination, I think so.
Fair enough.
India will fight against this.
Fair enough.
And the Americans, if they want to support it, that's it. Yeah.
Fair enough. Last word, yes or no answer, Maruf. Should the Indian side come out with the clear position, even though we know from sources that India doesn't really share that view on Iran, should they make it official? Yes or no?
Well, they should, but I don't think they will.
Okay. Okay, and there's a story in itself. Thank you, Maruf Raza, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Sekho and Ambassador Trigunayat. That was all the time we had on Newsnight. I've been Athar Khan. Thank you for watching.